Okay, so today we continue with our read aloud of what was the Underground Railroad. Last time we learned a little bit about what it is, a route to freedom, and we saw some pictures. So today we're going to learn about one of the most famous conductors on the Underground Railroad, the Great Conductor, Chapter 5. Harriet Ross Tubman was born in Maryland around 1820. Her parents could not read or write, so they could not record the exact date of her birth. She was originally called Araminta, or Minty, the fifth of the 9 children born to Harriet Ritt Green and Benjamin Ross. Edward Brodus was their master. When Minty was just a little girl, Brodus hired her out to another family. Minty had to watch the baby at night. If the baby cried, Minty got a whipping. She had to sleep on the floor. There was no mattress or blanket. To stay warm, she buried her feet in the ashes by the fire. One time, Minty took a sugar cube from the table. She had never tasted sugar before and could not resist. Then she hid in a pig pen to put off the whipping she knew would follow. When she was a young girl, Minty worked as a field hand. She liked being outside better than she liked being indoors. Once an overseer threw an iron weight at another slave, but it hit Minty in the head instead. Minty recovered, but she suffered from headaches and sleeping spells for the rest of her life. Sorry, I'm skipping a page there. Around 1844, she married a local free black named John Tubman. It was then that she started calling herself Harriet. In 1849, Mr. Brodus died. Harriet heard rumors that she was going to be sold. Fearing the worst, she decided to escape and go north. She wanted John to go with her, but he said no. So Harriet went by herself. Packing a little salt pork, some cornbread, and a quilt she had sewn, she set out at night. She was given shelter in the home of a Quaker woman in Maryland. When she left, she gave the woman the quilt as a gift. Harriet traveled by night using the North Star as a guide. Both white people and black people helped her along the way. Eventually, she reached Philadelphia. Since many people there were Quakers and against slavery, Philadelphia was a common destination for escaping slaves. When Harriet finally arrived, she said, "I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came out through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven. But there was another side to freedom. There was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land." Harriet got work as a maid. She was free, but she was also very lonely. So she made a plan. She'd save her money and return south. She'd help the rest of her family escape. Other slaves, too. In the 1850s, Harriet Tubman led between 11 and 19 trips. Harriet's work came to the attention of abolitionists throughout the North. They gave her money to keep going. She became a legend. People said she could see in the dark, sniff danger in the wind, and carry a grown man on her back for miles. These stories were not true, but her fame kept growing. In 1860, she made her last run as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. It was simply too dangerous for her to continue. Also, the Civil War broke out early in 1861. The northern states were now fighting against the 11 slaveholding southern states that had broken away from the Union. They called their new country the Confederate States of America. Slavery would always remain legal there. Now Harriet joined the war effort for the North. She became a nurse, tending to black soldiers and hundreds of runaway slaves who poured into Union Army camps. She also worked as a spy behind Southern lines. In early June 1863, she became the first woman to command an army raid. She guided a white colonel and his black troops to the Combahee River in South Carolina. There they destroyed bridges, railroad tracks, and stockpiles of cotton, food, and weapons. They also freed over 700 slaves. After the North won the war, slavery finally came to an end. Happily, there was no more need for the Underground Railroad, so its most famous conductor went back to the home she had bought in Auburn, New York. Harriet was especially proud of the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged, a place where poor elderly black people could live. It was on land right next to her house in Auburn. On March 10, 1913, Harriet Tubman died. She was over 90 and had led 300 people to freedom. She once told a crowd, "I was the conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years and can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." Chapter 6, Special Delivery. Harriet Tubman's name is found in almost every book about American history. Other slaves who escaped the South are not as famous, but their stories of courage are just as important. Henry Brown was a slave who lived with his mother, sisters, and brothers in the big house on a plantation in Virginia. In 1830, the master gave Henry away to his son. Henry was only 15. Now he lived in another town in Virginia. How he missed his family. Still, he worked hard for his new master. If he didn't, he would be beaten. A few years later, Henry met and fell in love with a woman named Nancy. She belonged to a different master. Both her master and Henry's master agreed to let them get married. Henry and Nancy were allowed to live together, and in time they had 3 children. They felt lucky until Nancy's master lost a lot of money. Henry was worried. What if Nancy's master sold her and their children? Sadly, that is exactly what happened. Henry watched his wife and children being led away. They were going to a new master in North Carolina. Henry knew he would never see them again. He felt like his heart had broken in two. For weeks, Henry was numb with grief. Things like this could happen because he and his family were enslaved. He refused to be a slave any longer. He had to be free, to be able to go where he wanted and do what he wanted. But how? Henry thought about it and came up with an unusual idea. He would climb into a large wooden box. He would have someone he trusted mail him to an address in Philadelphia. When he stepped out of the box, he'd be free. First, he ordered the box. It was 2 feet 8 inches deep. It was 2 feet wide, and it was 3 feet long. Henry wouldn't have much space inside it. The box was lined with a soft green fabric. That would make the trip a little more comfortable. He would carry a small bag of water and some biscuits. Holes in the box let in enough air. Henry spent $86 and about half of all the money he had to pay for the shipping. So many things could go wrong. Henry could be hurt or crushed in the box. He could be discovered. Then he would be sent back and punished. But Henry was determined. A friend of Henry's was a white abolitionist named Samuel A. Smith. He agreed to help mail Henry. Next, Henry needed an excuse to stay home from work. He got hold of a bottle of strong acid used for cleaning metal. Henry poured the acid on his hand. He burned his skin to the bone. It hurt horribly, but now he had a reason to stay home from work. Smith, who was a doctor, bandaged Henry's hand. They agreed to meet the next morning, March 23, 1849, at 4 a.m. Early the next morning, Henry met up with Dr. Smith. It was still dark out. Henry climbed into the box, and it was nailed shut. The box was going to be sent to another abolitionist, William H. Johnson, who lived on Arch Street in Philadelphia. On the top of the box was written, "This side up, with care." Henry's box traveled north by wagon, railroad, steamboat, and ferry. At one point, he landed upside down. He also could hear the sound of the waves. That meant he had to be on a ship going to Washington, D.C. Being stuffed inside the box was terrible. Blood rushed to Henry's head. His face felt hot. His eyes hurt. What if his head burst open? But he did not move or make a sound. At last the box was delivered to the office in Philadelphia. 4 men, all abolitionists, were there to greet it. One man tapped on the box. "All right?" he asked. "All right, sir," was Henry's reply from inside. The men used a saw and hatchet to cut open the box. Out stepped Henry. He had been traveling for 26 hours. He was so happy to be free, he sang a hymn from the Bible. Henry was given clothing and food. Then he took a walk outside in the fresh air. How good that air must have felt. Later, Henry became a speaker for the Anti-Slavery Society. He was given the nickname Box, and from then on he always called himself Henry Box Brown. He wrote his story. It was published first in Boston in 1849 and again in Manchester, England in 1851. When the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was passed, Henry fled to England. He was 100% safe there. He continued to speak out against slavery in his new country. He married a white woman and began a new family. In 1875, he came back to America with a Family Magic Act. No one knows where or when he died, but his brave and daring escape became part of the history of the Underground Railroad. Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. If runaway slaves were caught in any state, north or south, they had to be returned to their masters. Abolitionists called it the Bloodhound Law because of the dogs that tracked down escaping slaves. These slaves could not ask for a jury trial or to speak on their own behalf. In addition, any person aiding a runaway slave could be put in jail for 6 months and fined heavily. Law officers who captured a runaway slave were entitled to a bonus or a promotion. Chapter 7. The Sugar Barrel. Henry Brown was a grown man when he sent himself to freedom, but many runaway slaves were very young, hardly more than children. Here is Caroline Quarles' story. On July 4, 1842, people in St. Louis, Missouri were celebrating Independence Day. There were picnics and parades all over town, but 16-year-old Caroline Quarles was too busy to join the fun. Caroline took all the money she had and a box of clothes. She was headed for the Mississippi River. She was running to freedom. The streets were crowded. She had to avoid horses and people on her way to the docks. Caroline tried to blend in with the crowd. With her light skin and hair, she hoped to pass for white. At the docks, she saw many riverboats on the busy river. Caroline paid a few dollars for a ticket on one. It took her across the river to the free state of Illinois. There she rode in a stagecoach to the very last stop on the stagecoach line. She ended up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She was now 400 miles away from her master, Charles Hall. She believed she was safe. Milwaukee was home to many free blacks and former slaves. Caroline met a barber who seemed nice and offered her a place to stay. Caroline took him up on it. She was scared because even here in Milwaukee there were posters offering a reward for her capture. $300 was a lot of money. Although the barber had been a slave once himself, he couldn't stop thinking about the money. It would make him a rich man. The barber ended up telling slave catchers where to find Caroline. Caroline was still hidden in the barber's shack. She did not know what he had done. When she heard a knock on the door, she opened it. Was it a slave catcher? No! There stood Asahel Finch. He was a white man and an abolitionist. He had heard about the slave catchers coming for Caroline and wanted to warn her. Caroline fled just in time. A few minutes later, the barber returned with slave catchers. The slave catchers were furious that Caroline was gone. They gave the barber a beating. Then they went from house to house looking for the girl. Meanwhile, Caroline and Asahel Finch were heading to the river. They crawled through the brush and weeds, but they knew they would soon be discovered. Caroline and Finch both spotted an old barrel for storing sugar. It was almost covered by weeds. Finch pried off the lid. Caroline jumped inside. Once the barrel was shut, Finch ran off, promising to come back. For hours, Caroline remained stuffed in the barrel. It was hot, cramped, and dark. Later that night, Caroline heard a voice. Someone was here. Was it a slave catcher? How frightened she must have been. When the lid was pried off, there was Finch again. What a relief. Finch took Caroline to a safe house, a farm just outside of Milwaukee. Then other conductors took her to another safe house 30 miles away. It belonged to Samuel and Lucinda Doherty. Caroline hid there for 3 weeks. Meanwhile, the slave catchers hadn't given up looking for her. They set up headquarters in a local tavern. From there, they continued to search. The slave catchers were sneaky. They told other people they wanted to help Caroline by sending her home, and that if she gave herself up, they would give her freedom papers. But these were all lies. Caroline stayed hidden at the Doherty's house. One day, the slave catchers showed up at the Dohertys. Caroline ran to the cellar. The only way out was through a potato chute. The chute was slippery and narrow. With her long skirts and petticoats, she barely fit. but she squeezed in and climbed up it. Once she was outside, she crawled on her knees through a cornfield and hid. The slave catchers looked everywhere but did not find her. When it was dark, they left. Caroline was safe, at least for the time being. But she realized that she would never really be free anywhere in the United States. There was always the chance of being caught. She had to get to Canada. Of course, getting to Canada was not going to be easy. Most escaped slaves made the trip by ship, but there were too many slave catchers looking for her. The docks around Milwaukee and Kenosha were not safe. Again, two brave conductors came to Caroline's aid. One was named Lyman Goodnow. He decided to take Caroline to Canada himself. He told people that he was going to pay the Queen a visit. This was code for Canada, which was still ruled by Queen Victoria of England. With a pillowcase of food and a little money, they set off in a horse and wagon with Caroline hidden under hay and a buffalo robe. First, they went south to Illinois around Chicago. Then, they went through Indiana and up through Michigan. Along the way, they stayed at different stops on the Underground Railroad. Some were very grand houses, others were tiny shacks. They got wet, they got lost, they were often hungry and tired. They were always afraid of being caught, but they kept traveling for 500 miles. Finally, they reached the Detroit River in Michigan. Posters advertising a reward for Caroline's capture were there too. Slave catchers roamed the docks. Nevertheless, Caroline managed to cross the river in a ferry boat. When she stepped off on the other side, she was in Sandwich, Canada. Free! She could hardly believe it. She had been on the run from July through October of 1842. 4 months. She had come more than 1,000 miles. So here's Milwaukee, Wisconsin, came around this way through Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and crossed into Sandwich, Canada. Caroline Quarles lived in Canada for the rest of her life. She married Alan Watkins and had 6 children. She learned to read and write. Years later, in 1880, she wrote these words to her old friend Lyman. Dearest friend, pen and ink could hardly express my joy when I heard from you once more. I have never forgotten you nor your kindness. Just as soon as the postmaster read the name to me, your name, my heart filled with joy and gladness. The girl who once hid in a sugar barrel had a sweet ending to her journey on the Underground Railroad. And next time we will read Chapter 8, The Strength of Love.